Afrika. Dianne Hawker, I hope you've had time to think carefully about this next question. Judge Dunstan Mlambo talks about a judiciary that's operating in a somewhat toxic environment. He says the judiciary is attacked, and this is a function of a polarized political space. Might you anticipate some questions related to this line, and from whom might they come?
Well, I think, Xoli, you were suggesting that this was going to be a tricky question, but it's not quite as tricky as you suggested. Look, the questions are definitely going to come on what he means about this polarized environment and the toxicity that he mentioned. It's important to note that the Judicial Service Commission's composition actually has a number of political or politicians as part of its composition. There are 10 members from Parliament, 6 from the National Assembly and 4 from the National Council of Provinces. And I would imagine that the questions relating to what he means about this toxic environment is likely to come from those people who also occupy benches in Parliament and simultaneously occupy chairs here on the JSC. Of course, all the commissioners, all the candidates thus far have been asked about the state of the judiciary and what they think can be done about it, but also about how they engage with the media. I think the question is likely to come at him in that perspective, because he spoke about that issue of toxicity and suggesting that there is a need to respond in some way from the judiciary when those attacks, and that's using his words, come in the direction of the judiciary.
Yeah, Dianne, earlier I had a sit-down with Advocate Ntsebeza here in studio, and I asked him about potentially the next 2 interviews degenerating, as some might have suggested, particularly in the social media space. But he is of the view that Justice Pete, who is chairing these interviews, is a capable leader who will not allow for a circus to occur. Do you agree with him?
I do agree with that assessment, Xoli, but also I think it's important to note that oftentimes when the questioning does become a bit more, take more of a political direction, those members of the JSC who come from the legal profession do tend to try and balance things out with more legal questions, asking about things like judgments, asking about court processes, asking about, the education sector as it relates to the judiciary. Commissioners like Commissioner Kane, for example, and Commissioner Schlemmer are known to also create that kind of balance. And I think that also speaks to the composition of the JSC and why it was made up like that. But it's also important to note, Xoli, that the JSC was in a way wrapped over the knuckles for taking a bit of a harsh approach in the previous Constitutional Court interviews that took place last year, the ones that they actually had to redo because of the tone of some of those questions and because of some of the imbalance. So if you look at this session, it has been a much more measured session. It hasn't really had that kind of I would almost say antagonistic approach that we saw in those Constitutional Court interviews. And I hope that it will continue in this way for the benefit of the South Africans who are watching this process.
Yeah. Let's talk about one of the questions that came out yesterday, and this was during the interview of Justice Mandisa Maya, and the question had to do with whether or not the country is ready for a woman Chief Justice. That's something that she did not take kindly to, and I'm relating it directly to what you have just said now. Let me complicate the question for you in this way, and I'm going to quote Panim Tomboti. You will know him as a columnist, particularly in the Sunday papers. He had this to say yesterday, and I quote him now: JSC members trying hard to show they gender sensitive are the same people who last time around angrily tore into Daya Pillay, an excellent jurist, with Mogoeng even suggesting she was in it for the money. Guess they were just being racist, then sexist. Your thoughts?
Well, I think, Xoli, the question of the JSC's approach to women candidates overall is problematic. And not only in relation to these interviews. I mean, I've been covering some of these interviews going back several years. And every year, the women candidates are asked questions about their difficulties in achieving certain positions, and also about briefing patterns. And while, it does give an opportunity for them to speak about their personal experiences, it asks the people that have been at a disadvantage questions about what should be done about that disadvantage. In my view, that doesn't quite make sense. They are on the receiving edge of the discrimination, but they are being asked to offer solutions about how to not discriminate. Those solutions don't sit with them. They sit with people like the Justice Minister, who can legislate or who can suggest legislation. They sit with Parliament, who can also work on legislation that can help to improve some of these issues. They certainly don't sit with the Chief Justice, whose main responsibility is to deal with the judiciary. So it is a problematic line of questioning. It's one that now we've seen this question of, is South Africa ready, repeated for the third day, and most likely will be repeated tomorrow. But I think after this process, the JSC might want to do some introspection about what's the purpose of this kind of questioning and whether it actually helps in understanding whether a candidate would be a good Chief Justice or not.
Let's conclude our conversation, Dianne, with a discussion about the financial space that the judiciary finds itself in. Dunstan Mlambo making no bones about the executive, which he says is always cutting budgets. And he says this needs a rethink. In my mind, I was thinking that he's actually talking directly to the minister responsible for the justice space, and that's Ronald Lamola, who is in the room.
Yes, absolutely, Xoli. I think the candidates have been taking this opportunity to put some early agenda items on the table with the Justice Minister in the event that they do get elected to this position. Justice Meyer yesterday, for example, also spoke about resource constraints and saying that, the judiciary, the Chief Justice, needs to be much more involved in not only the allocation of the budget, but how that budget is spent. She's talked about laptops, expensive laptops that judges get given and other paraphernalia that's nice to have, but at the same time essentials like materials that they need for court processes not being available. And we're hearing something similar now from Judge President Mlambo, who was also at that leadership level, has been grappling obviously with dealing with issues, these kinds of issues with his colleagues, pointing out these concerns and saying that there are extreme resource constraints in his court and across the country that need to be addressed as a matter of urgency.